Every one of us carries a story we don't always talk about. The quiet battles, the heavy days, the moments that cracked us open, and the moments that stitched us back together. We've all stumbled. We've all broken. We've all stood at the edge of something we weren't sure we could come back from. And somehow, through strength we didn't know we had, we rose anyway. Because inside every person, there is a spark that refuses to die, a hope that refuses to stay silent, a heart that refuses to give up no matter how dark the night gets. And that's why we're here, to listen, to learn, to witness the courage it takes just to be human. Every soul you hear on the show has walked through something that shaped them, sharpened them, and carried them forward. Everyone has a story. Everyone has a battle. Everyone has a journey. And this is where you come to hear it. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I'm Uncle Jimmy, and today we're talking about faith, rebirth, and the extraordinary power of one's person decision to live truth out loud. My guest today, Prophet Harmony, is a name you don't just read or hear, you feel. Also known as H.A.E. the Prophet, she's a visionary, author, poet, and prophetic spiritual guide whose work moves through art, ministry, and healing like a current. Powerful, unfiltered, and undeniably human. Her voice, both literal and creative, has become a mirror for anyone standing between who they were and who they're becoming. She weaves together prophetic insight and poetic conviction. She confronts brokenness not to shame it, but to show how beauty still breathes inside of it. See, Prophet Harmony doesn't speak from a pedestal. She speaks from the trenches of transformation. Her story is one of radical honesty and redemptive rebuilding. A creative soul who stepped out of the spotlight into self-excavation, determined to meet her own truth without the mask. In 2021, after her styling and branding company faced structural collapse, most people might have seen that as an ending. But for Prophet Harmony, endings are often whispers from heaven guiding us toward alignment. Instead of rebuilding what broke, she birthed something new, her own enterprise. H.A.E. the Prophet, LLC, a living testament to restoration, resilience, and revelation. Through that work, she has claimed her calling as a total restoration architect, teaching others how to move from healing to healed, how to rebuild the inner infrastructure of self-worth, and how to restore integrity between faith and identity. She reminds us that healing has a blueprint and that authenticity is not soft. It's the most courageous form of truth-telling there is. Today, we're going to talk about that kind of courage, the kind that doesn't ask for applause but for accountability. We're going to explore how poetry, prophecy, and purpose come together when a woman decides to live completely free. We're going to talk about the lessons behind her acclaimed book, Read Me for Filth, and the raw confessions of her follow-up, I Know What You Want, but an Ass Is All You Need. Works that just don't entertain, but disarm, confront, and heal. Because Prophet Harmony is not just here to inspire you, she's here to challenge you, to ask you how much of yourself are you still hiding behind fear, behind faith, behind filters. This is the kind of conversation that stirs your soul. So wherever you are, whether you're driving, cleaning, journaling, or just quietly breathing through another day, turn your heart, not just your ears, because what's coming is testimony and truth, story and tragedy, faith and fire. And like any real conversation worth having, it may leave you undone, but it will put you back together stronger. Family, it's my honor to welcome her in her full authenticity, with all reverence she deserves. The poet, the prophet, the architect of healing, Prophet Harmony.
Listen, that was great. Like, that was better than any bio that I have. So I'm like, who is he talking about? So
Talking about
thank
you,
you.
Queen. Talking about you.
I am so appreciative that you actually allowed me the grace to be on your platform tonight to spread the table of truth. I'm honored to be here with you. I even came dressed as my fisherman self, my hunter self. I was doing my research and I was like, yeah, this is my kind of guy. So I can go and be my artistic self. But when I have this is my special lucky hat. When I have it on around my grandkids, it means I'm invisible. So on the podcast, I'm not invisible tonight, but I am going to be telling a whole lot of truth. So I appreciate you for allowing me this opportunity. So let's dig in and let's have a good show.
Yeah, let's have a great show. And we're so excited and honored to have you here as well. You know, I've done my research. We've been going back and forth on social media talking, and I'm excited. So tell everybody about yourself, where you started, where you were from, and a little bit about your journey in life and how it started and, where you are, where it led you to. We'll start off first. Where were you born and raised, and what was it like where you were born and raised?
For sure. So my name is Prophet Harmony, and even though I actually have a title where I was mantled in the church eventually, but I was actually first given the title prophet in the streets, being a, try not to get the show audited, being a,
Hey, we're unfiltered here. This is my platform, and I like to tell people, be yourself. You know,
gotcha,
you can say what you want, you can swear, you can do whatever you want. You know, this is the raw, unfiltered truth. The only
so,
thing we don't tolerate here is hate. That's it.
gotcha. So at one point in my life, I used to be a illegal pharmaceutical transportation logistics manager out in the streets. And so I actually got the name prophet or the title prophet in the streets before I ever got it from the church. And I believe that was a direct reflection of what they saw in me from my childhood up until that point in my 20s. And so I didn't get to God the way most people do, or most proclaimed church people or prophets do. I started off my childhood in trauma. I was molested. I was physically assaulted, emotionally assaulted by my mother. By 8 years old, I had attempted to kill my stepfather. So the mental capacity that it takes for an 8 year old to plan a murder and then try to actually go through with it. And of course, it didn't work. And so when I could not kill him, because when I found out what he was doing to me was wrong, it turned into rage. And so when I couldn't kill him, I tried to kill myself, and that didn't work either. So by 8, I had already attempted murder and had already attempted suicide. That was my first suicide attempt at 8 years old.
So 8 years old, you know, you're going through all that, and you know, no kid at 8 years old, no kid at all should be having to endure what you went through. You know, it's such a young age. You know, it sort of hits home when you hear stories like this. You know, especially because of kids. They're supposed to be joyous and happy, and here you are trying to protect yourself essentially and kill the perpetrator that was hurting you and putting you down, and then that didn't work, and then you almost you try to kill yourself. So in all, just in the short span of 8 years, you're 8 years old, you're going through this, and I can only imagine if there is a message to your younger self, right now, what would you say to your younger self?
To my younger self, and I've journaled about this so much throughout my healing journey from when I started therapy in my 20s, and of course, going through cycles of therapy, and then even going through more cycles of therapy as I counsel other people. Right. One of the things that I always say that I would say to my younger self or my 8 year old self would be thank you. Thank you. You've done your job. You did your job excellently to the best that you could, to the best of your power. And now you can rest.
Powerful. That's powerful. So 8 years old, you go through all that, in this is down in the South.
Mhm.
This is all going on. And so take us after that, because I know you just talked about going through therapy and all that. And we'll get to that later on, because part of, and I'd like to tell people, and people need to realize this, that the healing journey does not happen overnight. It's not something that happens in 24 hours. For a lot of people, it's something that doesn't happen in years. It takes years and years, but it also takes practice of, I like to say, forgiving yourself, forgiving others, and first learning to love yourself as well. So let's segue back to, 8 years old, you're going through all that. You try to kill, and then you try to commit suicide. So what happens after all that?
So it was funny. One of the things that you brought up, is being in the South. And of course, we're in the Bible Belt, right? I grew up in Louisiana, and that was part of the problem. And so I am from, or was born into, a ministerial family.
Oh, okay.
My uncle was the prominent pastor in the city at that time. And so my mother, of course, was attached to her brother. There was a lot of what I like to say I define now as performative ministry, where there's a certain behavior in service, but then only certain people see what happens after service at home and
Behind closed doors.
behind closed doors. So as a young child, I got to experience both sides of that. And so I kind of grew up with the mentality where I didn't trust God, because I was like, I don't understand how you can work at the altar, or you can work in church, or you can work on Sunday, but you don't work in my house. You don't work for me. And so I actually hated God as a child. I grew to hate God, and I lived that way into my 20s, where I felt like, if this is the God that you guys are serving, I don't want no parts of it. And
Nothing to do
so
with it.
didn't want to
Yeah.
have anything to do with that. But that led me into some destruction as well as a young adult. I left home early. I married early to the wrong person and ended up being in a marriage that
Yeah.
was abusive.
And how old were you at that point when you get married?
So I got married at 21.
Okay, so you're basically 21. You're out there looking for love in all the wrong places.
Looking for love,
Searching.
looking for a daddy, looking for escape. Um,
Yeah, exactly.
okay. So I ended up in a abusive marriage, and then I ended up being a single parent out of that marriage. And so it got to the point for me, Unc, where after that I decided it was either I was going to strip, I was either going to strip, I was going to shake something fast, or either I was going to sell drugs because I had to make ends meet.
Yeah, you had to take care of yourself, and essentially, you had to take care of your kid as well.
I
You
knew I
know,
wasn't going back home. Going back home was not an option.
yeah, back to the performative, ministry, as you like to say.
Not only that, but my mother stayed with my stepfather, even though the abuse was known. She stayed with him until, eventually he left with her best friend.
Wow,
Yeah. So for me, not going home was not an option, and so I chose the life of the streets because I just at that time, I weighed over 350 pounds. I did not have
wow.
body to shake something fast, so I picked the streets, and so I did
Streets
that.
didn't.
Yeah, I actually picked the streets. And so something very, very transformative happened while I was at there. It was a couple of things for me because my soul was right, or my soul felt right. I felt a connection to God to some degree. I just didn't want to step foot in a church to get God. And so I had this Robin Hood complex while I was out doing street ministry, right? So I would make money. I was taking care of myself. I was good, as
Bills were
good
getting
as
paid. You
be.
got a roof over your head, food on the table. Your kids getting taken care of. All that.
Not only that, though, I would go to my daughter's school and pay off school lunches,
Okay.
or I would go buy coats and put coats and water and clothes in the trunk of my car and disperse that.
Yeah, taking care of the community almost.
I wasn't doing it for applause. I was doing it from my heart. And so my eyes were ice cold, but my heart was still game. And so something very traumatic didn't happen to me necessarily, but it happened for me. At that time, I was under the number one female drug dealer in California, and we were all set. It was a team of about 21 of us during different functions, right? And so we were all on call to do a massive drop between 5 cities, between Ojai, if you know anything about California, between Ojai and Long Beach. All of us had to work that one night. And she pulled me to the side. And it was the night that I was supposed to take my final. And this was a big money night, right? And so I was like, I'll reschedule that final. I don't care about the final. I want my money.
I want that bread.
Right. So she pulled me to the side. She said, "You're too smart. You're not even really supposed to be out here anyway. Go take your final." And you don't kind of talk back to the number one drug dealer. You don't really talk back to her. But I didn't understand what, and she told me, "I got you." And I didn't understand what that meant. While I was taking my final, all of the 5 houses that we were transporting or supposed to transport to in that drop, there was a raid on all 5 houses at one time. Out of the 21, 22 people that were on our team, I'm the only one that didn't go to jail because
And
I
by the
wasn't
grace of God, the boss, spared you. No, told you, hey, go take that test. You shouldn't be out here anyways.
right. So the next day, her sister called me because I didn't know what happened because I was, taking my final. The next day, her sister called me and asked me to meet up with her. And she gave me a manila envelope and she told me that her sister said, "Get out of town." And 2 weeks later, I went into hiding. And that explains why I don't go by Shantae Moore as much as I now go by Harmony.
Harmony.
So for about 10 years, I was kind of in hiding. And so she told me to get out of town. I left 2 weeks later and I was relocated. And I made a promise that if I got out of that situation, and we're not supposed to monkey jungle God. I'm 25 at that time, and that's what I do. But I said, if you get me out of this situation, I promise I will do whatever I need to do to see what it feels like if I didn't have the hurt attached to me. Because a lot of the things that I was doing was out of the hurt trying to protect myself. The way I was dressing, the way I acted in the streets, my mentality, everything became a priority for me to protect myself against pain.
Yeah.
And so that's how I acted. And so I wanted to
It
see
seems
what.
like, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but it seems like, ever since a young kid, that's all you have experienced is pain and hurt. You talked about growing up, then you leave home, You get married, you have a kid, he leaves, an abusive relationship, and then you turn to the streets where almost like, people sometimes don't understand that. I live here, I'm here in Dorchester in Boston, Mass. And, you got people running the streets here. And, believe me, people don't realize it. Sometimes there's, when you turn to the streets, there are people there that welcome you in like family,
Like
the family you've never had. And people sometimes don't realize that some of these young kids growing up in gangs and, selling drugs and carrying guns, they're doing that to survive because at home they can't survive. So, hey, shit, they go find a gang and they feel at home, they feel that everything's okay. And I'm not saying it's right that they're out there selling drugs or carrying guns, but sometimes you got to look at it from outside the box and realize that, these situations sometimes are like you were looking for, to be a safe place, somewhere to be safe. Everywhere you turned, there was nothing but, hurt. So here you are on the streets. The houses get raided. You get the manila envelope, and then you hit the road. You said you hit the road. So what was it like for that 10 years? You were on the road.
So that is actually when I turned inward, and that's when, out of the blue, I decided I had dealt with some of my issues with sleeping in the dark. Right, I was scared of the dark until my mid 30s, until like 32 years old. And so even with that, Uncle Jim, that led me to sleeping with people, not because I loved them, not because I was sexually attracted to them, but just because I didn't want to be alone. Right, I didn't want to be in the dark. And so I handled some issues with that. By then, I had started therapy. I was into ministry by then. I had gotten into ministry based on the fact that just one day I randomly wanted to hear an organ play after I had swore for 2 decades that I would never step foot in a church
Ever again. Yeah.
ever again. Even with the situation with my uncle at my uncle's church, there was a situation there at 15 because I've always been a good listener. I've always been a good reader. And so my mother had us in another church at 15, and the pastor would always ask, well, how was my sermon? And I would tell him, and then I would tell him, you started hollering when people went to sleep. You didn't finish the story. And so after a couple of those, and I'm 15. And so
Yeah.
after a couple of those conversations, he asked me to come into his office, and my mother told me to go. And so when he went into the office and closed the door, he asked me what would I do if I kissed him or if he kissed me. And I said, talk to God about it. Now, this is my demeanor at 15. And so he didn't pursue. He kind of just sat down and he looked at me. And then I unlocked the door myself and walked out of the office. But these are the situations that I'm dealing with as a child that said I'm not stepping foot in a church until 32 years old. And I wanted to hear organ. And so, Uncle Jim, this is the crazy part, right? I go
And
sit on the back.
you just had that feeling out of nowhere. You just wanted to hear the organ.
Yeah. I just wanted to hear organ. Like, I love music.
Yeah.
And I just started having this fit where I wanted to hear a choir and I wanted to hear organ. But I think that was just the trajectory of me being set up for a comeback. So what happens is I sit on the back row of this random church that I had been invited to. And this 4 or 5 year old little boy jumps up from his mother and he came and sat on the bench with me. I don't know what happened in church, Uncle Jim. I can't tell you what happened. I don't know what was said. I played with the little boy,
Yeah.
the entire service. He stuck his arm in my face before I could say anything. He was like, "Smell me." I took a bath. Like, we played the whole service. And so the next Sunday, I decided I wanted to go back just to see if the little boy was there. And he was. And so this time I sat closer to where his mother was and I sat behind him and he immediately jumped down and he sat up on the bench next to me. He blew his breath real fast and I didn't have time to catch my breath. He was like, "Smell my breath. I brushed my teeth." And from that turned into me dealing with the youth of that church. It turned into me being a youth leader to a youth pastor to, at one point, I was over everybody from 0 to 24.
And
So
that was the church you initially started at, where you wanted to hear just the
oh,
organ and the choir, and you go in, right? And I'm not one that believes in coincidences, right? That God was working through that small child, you
that's what I
know?
say. I
That was
say
God working through that small child, putting you in that place.
my invitation back into Christ was through a 4-year-old.
Yeah. Yep.
I
Powerful.
wholeheartedly believe that.
Powerful. And like I said, I read a bit about you and I didn't hear that part, but once you started saying that to me, and then you said, oh, I was over everybody from, 1 to 24, that was God working through that child to
Mhm.
say to you, hey, welcome back, sis. Welcome back. Welcome home. you know?
And that's part of the healing process. I love children. Like children, if you want to see, not one of those prophets, or not one of those leaders that's very passive at certain things and letting God fix everything and God will judge. There are some things that you will absolutely see my fangs about and my claws. And children is one.
Is one of them, no doubt about
Children is one. And so that is my lane.
that's, just sitting here going through it, just thinking about it, and it just, just the power of God, the miraculous of him just putting that child there, and putting you almost back on track, sis, being like, hey, I know we've had our differences, we've had a little bit of struggle, but I'm always here. I'm still here, and I like to tell people this all the time. I tell people all the time, it's okay to pray, right? When things are going bad, because that's when mostly everyone prays, right? But what
Right.
about praying when you get up in the morning and everything's good and the heat's on and you got food on the table and you got a cup of coffee and everything's good? You can pray too when everything's good, you know?
Absolutely. That's the difference. That's the difference of between religion and relationship.
Yeah.
Right? To me, now this is the don't quote me. Well, you can quote me, just put my name on it because I feel this way. A lot of religion is performative. Relationship requires a different set of responsibility and a different set of actions, a different set of accountability. And so it's not just when it's good or when it's bad that I seek them. I seek them regardless because that's the relationship that I have. I love them. I love them because I love them. And so even if there's not streets of gold, even if there's not the 10 virgins that were promised,
Yeah.
every religion has their certain promises. I don't care about any of that. I've gotten to the point where I love them because I love them. And that's
Exactly.
it.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's how it should be. I tell people all the time, I grew up here in Boston. It's a big, predominantly Irish Catholic where I grew up. Everybody goes to church. I went to Catholic school my whole life except sixth, seventh, and eighth grade. I was lucky enough to get a private education doing that.
Mm.
But I tell people, I don't go to church, but I have a relationship with God. Just because I don't step foot in his house doesn't mean that I don't have a relationship with him,
Well, be
and
honest,
it's okay.
you are the church. Wherever your
Yeah.
feet tread, you're the church.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
there's different ways to look at it. Tomato, tomato.
No, no doubt about it. But the mainstream, the
Right.
mainstream religion wants you to go to the synagogue. They want you to go to the mosque. They want you to go to the church. They want you to give. And I'm not telling people how to believe. I'm not telling people how to live their life. I'm just saying, hey, for me, I can wake up in the morning. I can be grateful. I can look above, say, hey, thanks for another day. I'm grateful. Because I tell people all the time, you never know. Right now, this could be the last time we talk, the last time I see you, the last time you see me. You never know what tomorrow's going to bring. It's not guaranteed for any of us. So
Right.
I live in the present. I live in the
Right.
present moment right now. So here you are. You back in the church, overseeing the kids.
Mhm.
0 to 24. So what's
Mhm.
that like? How are you feeling then? How's life going then for you?
So, of course, whenever you shift gears, there's always that high RPM in the beginning, but then it begins to level out, right? I began to notice things that I thought would have dissipated by the time I became an adult.
Things inside of you, feelings, and
Things inside of the church.
inside of the church. Okay. Yep.
Yeah. The system of the church.
Yep. So
And
you're sitting
also,
back and seeing these things going on that you're not liking.
yeah. And I'll tell you about a dream that I had. I had a dream in my early 30s. That I walked into a building and at that time I didn't know what clerical wear was, or all I knew was in my dream it looked like nurses or nuns, right? They had on the black with the white collar. I didn't know what any of that meant at that time. And so I walked into a building and I had on a black robe, but I didn't have the white collar on. And when I walked into to this warehouse room, on one side of the wall, there was stacks of beds, like bunk beds, like the bunker, and it had children laying in the bunkers, and in some of the beds there were adults. And so there was this nun or someone who was dressed like a nun that was giving me a tour of the room, and they were telling me like what was going on. But in the dream, it was mute. I couldn't hear. I could just see. And so I saw things flying up and down, tending to the children. Some of them were actually in the bed with the children. And as he was talking, I saw a tail come up from under one of the gowns. And then when I looked to tell the person who was talking to me, it had a tail. And we started fighting in my dream. We both ended up on the floor. and then I woke up. So I've always known that a lot of the things that I say and do or see or call out were going to be in contrary to what the masses and the systems think and see. So if I'm in a church and I'm over the youth, right? I've been molested, so I know what that feels like, right? So require a background check. That to me, that's common sense.
No doubt
But
about
then when you have an entity that fights, we don't want to have a background check. Well, why? And so I'm not assimilating. You gotta answer why you don't want to have a background check for your children. And because I've lived my childhood, because I've been in the streets, because I've done things out in the streets that caused me not to have a whole lot of fear. You don't forget how to pull a trigger, right? So even if I am a minister now, or even if I am a youth pastor now, I still haven't forgot how to pull the trigger. And so I'm just not scared. So when there's questions like that that can't be answered, then it started making me scratch my head like, okay, so this is still a system. Some churches still operate as a system. At that same time that I'm going through that, I was going through changes with my own identity, my own sexuality, and me shifting from where I was to where I saw myself. And so there was a shift there as well. So I was going through conundrums morally and in reality with myself, at the same time. And so having to deal with that caused injury because there was some beliefs that I thought had would have healed itself, by the time I had grown from a child up into my 30s, and it had not. So it was still run of the mill kind of stuff still happening.
Oof. So when you're going through all that, you were talking about background checks and, when did you talk to the people at the church about that? And
Absolutely.
what did they have to say?
We ended up with background checks.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it just makes sense. It's one of those things where, we had our issues here with the Catholic Church, with the
Hmm.
altar boys, and I was in Catholic school basically my whole career, education, and I didn't see any of that, but you heard stories, and it's just it's the worst thing. People preying on young kids, the future of the church, the future of our country, the future of our,
But it happens.
it
But
does.
you'll be surprised how much it happens. So yeah, it was not without a fight.
Yeah.
It was not without a fight. It was not without me being marked as hard to deal with. It was not marked without me being unrelatable, but it also came from a source that had a background.
Yeah.
And so part of being a prophet is being able to be okay with confrontation and being comfortable with confrontation. Not always, but in certain instances, confrontation is just the answer. You can't be scared to fight.
No, because it's not like you're fighting for something that's wrong. You're fighting for something that's right. And obviously, the person that you're talking to had a checkered background, checkered past, and there, and I don't think that you're one that hides your past. You tell people.
What's the first one?
Yeah.
I was the first one to submit. And there is also a level of spiritual abuse here too that we teach because we teach compassion over everything,
Yeah.
right? Here was a question I was presented when I was before the board, like to renew my ordination at one point, and I was asked if a child molester had done their time and was in recovery, and they wanted to come into the church and work with children. How would I feel, and would I allow it as the youth pastor?
Could I give you
And
my
my
answer?
answer, I'll tell you mine. My answer was hell no.
No. Exactly.
And so when I was asked to further explain my answer, and they kind of pushed the issue because Jesus
Yeah.
forgives, God forgives. We go into that whole bypassing thing. And so my answer and my response, and I stood still on it, was if that be the case, you let them work with you. But no one comes in to test their moral accountability on the children.
Yeah.
You can let them test it on you, but not on them and not on my.
No, exactly. And people don't. I mean, some people don't realize the rate of recidivism in child molesters is almost 100%. There's no, from when I went to college and studied it, there's not much of anything that can stop them. It's in their head, and it's always going to be in their head, and there's not enough prison time that they can do because they're always going to have those thoughts, and some of them act on it, some of them don't, but there's no really fix. And that would be a hell no for me too. Saying, hey, can he come work with the children? No, nope.
Yeah.
And
I was willing to turn in my papers that day. I was willing to turn in my papers. They could have my robe. They could have everything they wanted, but I wasn't okay with that.
No. And so you're basically standing on your business. You're standing up for the kids,
Mhm.
and almost you're standing up for the little girl yourself when you were 8 years old for everything you went through.
Through therapy, I learned that, and part of me protecting children and fighting, advocating for children's right, advocating for women's right who've been abused, part of that work is me also healing that
Your inner
version of
child.
me.
Yeah. Yeah. And I can say that because, I've done 17 years of therapy myself. I lost my dad almost 16 years ago. My dad was
Okay.
52. So ever since then, I've been in therapy, out of therapy, back and forth, and, healing the wounds of not just loss, but everyday loss, loss in the community, loss of my father, loss of girlfriend, I have an ex-wife, a couple ex-girlfriends, but
You too, pimping.
But I'm still grateful every day. Every day I get up. Every day I have a job. Every day I got a roof over my head. Every day I got food on the table because, I've been lucky enough that my mom and dad, there was 7 of us, including myself. My mom and dad, it made 9 of us in the household. And, we had that small community. We had, we went to grandma's sometimes, or we went to aunt and uncles, and we went to great aunt and uncles. And, we had that village around us that always supported us and always showed us,
Mhm.
the right way to do things. But also, the one thing to do is make sure you're grateful. Make sure you're grateful for everything you have, because it
Right.
can be taken away in an instant like that,
An
you
instinct.
know? So I'm
And
just I'm just grateful, I'm grateful that you're on, you're sharing your journey, So we're learning that, you here you are standing on business, young age, you leave home, just to recap a little bit, you get married, you're in an abusive relationship, you leave, you're on the streets, you're about to make probably the biggest deal you've ever made. You were told by the boss, hey, not tonight, you got to go take that test. So you go take the test, houses get raided, people go to jail, you get on the run, then you find yourself, hey, back in church. All
Mhm.
she wanted to do was hear the organ in the choir, and she goes in, and there's a young little boy there, 4 years old, and that was God working his magic, telling her, hey, prophet, harmony, come back, we need you. So then you have some issues, you're the highest person in the church for kids from 0 to 24, youth ministering, just to, all the kids, and you're doing a great job, and then here you are telling them basically, hey, I'm ready to give up everything because we're not going to have no child molester coming in here working with kids. So
Mhm.
you're just standing on business ever since you were a kid. Just stand on business. That's one thing I've learned. You stand on business. You stand on your laurels. You stand on what you believe in. But everything you believe in is kindness, is compassion, is love. When you said to me that you had them cold eyes, right? But you still had that
Mhm.
hot.
Part was still
The heart
game.
was still, and thank God you didn't close that heart off, because imagine where you would be today. You don't even, who knows if you'd be alive.
Right. Probably not.
If you stayed on the streets doing what you were doing, you had them cold eyes, but you had the heart that was open. If you had closed that heart, your heart went black, and then, So take us to what happens after that. You're doing the youth ministry, you're doing good. You're standing on your business. You're telling the church basically, hey, this is how it's going to go. We're not going to allow certain things. You're watching
Mhm.
from a, you're watching, you're seeing what's going on, but also you're starting to change things in the church. You're starting to change some things. So
Mhm.
what's that? What goes on after that?
Well, anytime, and it's ahead of time. When you're operating 5 to 10 years ahead of time.
Yep.
Most people don't like change anyway, regardless.
Nobody likes change.
So then to have to change to a degree to something you can't foresee, becomes a moment of tension. And so after about 15 years, 12 years of serving at that particular ministry, I walked away.
Okay.
And one of the things that I became okay with my release, I'm talk a little war talk, right, real quick, right? Because if you are on the front line of a war, if you stay on that front line beyond your time, not only do you put yourself in danger, but you put your comrades in danger as well. So part of ministry is knowing when to go forward, when to stay still, and when to back off. And backing off doesn't necessarily always mean retreat. It could just mean realignment. And so I did remove myself from that ministry. I felt really good when I took over the kids. I had kids. Of course, it was a predominantly black church. I had children in the ministry who did not like the texture of their hair.
Yeah.
They didn't like their nose. I had one African American little boy who wanted to be Caucasian.
Okay.
So everything he drew, everything he wrote, he disliked
himself.
himself, his color.
So what was
I
that like?
changed.
What was that like to you? Hearing
Oh, it was
those
heartbreak.
stories?
It was heartbreaking, and it was also a mirror.
Yeah.
It was also a mirror because there were things about me that I didn't like as an adult. And so hearing them not like stuff about themselves and they're dealing with that at the age that I was dealing with suicide and murder, it broke my heart. So I tried to come up with solutions and hear answers from God and revert everything back to God in a way that they could understand at their age. And when I was getting ready to make the decision on whether to leave, the young boy finally colored one of his angels the same skin color as he
He was,
was.
yeah.
And I knew at that point my job, my duty there, my assignment there was up.
Yeah, the mission wasn't done, but the assignment was over. So what happens after that? What do you do then?
So after that, I actually began modeling because by then I had lost weight. I had lost weight. I had started, I was getting into the process of completing the transition from being very, very masculine presenting to being more feminine. So I had started modeling. I had got into that world. And even in that world with me modeling, I would not tell people who I was in ministry. Like I would leave that out
Yeah.
in some kind of way. I would always be referenced back to that. And so and that's kind of where HAE the Prophet was born, out of the arts, the modeling, me painting, me drawing, me writing poetry. I started doing spoken word. At that time I had my own band, I had my own background vocals. So I kind of just emerged and missed myself in the art world.
Yes, you're almost like, you almost freed yourself, once you left, you sort of took off, you sort of went into new ventures, new, singing, having a band, but also, almost what was it like then still? I can only imagine you're still on your healing journey still,
Mhm.
going through all that, but
I'm always
so
on a healing
always,
journey. And
always.
so
But what's the new chapter like? You get into modeling. Did you ever think, 20, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, you'd be doing modeling?
no.
No. Yeah.
No, and I had another dream. I saw an image. And at that time I went to my spiritual covenant and I described what I saw. And she said, that's you seeing yourself in the future. And I said, no, it's not, because I didn't look anything like that. I was like, that can't be me. So no, if you go to my page, there are modeling pictures. There are there on my page, swimsuit pictures where I was modeling for a swimsuit designer. So it was that from 350 plus
Yeah.
pounds. So a size 28 in women down to a size 4'6" in a model.
Yeah.
If someone had told me at 22 that I would ever be printed in a magazine as a model, I would have told them they was a funky lip liar.
So what's that like though? What's that like from, the transition? So you transition basically, from the streets to the church. Now you're on a new journey, modeling and arts and painting and you're still trying to find yourself during that at those points still?
Well, actually, that was probably the most freest I had been because I still would end up back in the church.
Okay. Cuz I was just going to ask you that. Is that the freest that
I
you've
would
felt?
I would, you know you know, I would say I wasn't going, I'm not doing this, and then, somebody who would see me out, backstage, right? And then I'll be asked to pray. "What y'all asking me to pray? Like,
How do they
how
know?
did I why are you asking me?" And then that would end up to asking me to be on a program for something or, me coming to church to do something, and so I never really just
So
got
God was
away.
always still tearing at your heartstrings, always.
Yeah, I always said, "Well, just Jesus, just let me be a let me be a painter,
Yeah.
or so let me do something, minor." And whenever we say what we don't want to do, usually that's what we end up doing anyway.
Yeah.
And so I always ended back up there in some type of capacity, doing some type of work. Yeah.
Yeah, but you're still on your healing journey, still healing, but now you're doing arts. In
So
So
yeah.
what's that
So I
like?
think
Your mindset then, it's a bit freeing, it's a bit.
so that kind of led me over into where I am now, that transition. Because what I learned, being around different people, and I'm grateful for my story now because I'm not restricted. I can sit down and have a conversation with anybody.
Yeah.
I always tell people if I am sitting on the front row and an abused person comes in, hey, tell them come sit next to me just so I can show so you can see what the Lord has done. If a drug dealer comes in, come, sit them next to me. And so you can see what the Lord has done. If a prostitute, because I've had some, midnight what you doing texts. I've done that too.
Yeah.
Come, sit them next to me so you can see what the Lord has done. And so my experience has allowed me to be able to be in different rooms, different tables, different conversations. Here's the part, lean in, without being judgmental.
Yeah.
And that makes the difference.
No doubt about it, because, you've lived it. You've been through it,
Yeah. Right.
and you don't want to, you know, I find people, nowadays everyone's too judgmental. Everyone, oh, this, you're that. I like to tell people, that's the greatest thing about, for me, is having my podcast, is having a space where people can come, be themselves, as I like to say, right? One of my
Right.
biggest things that people, when they send me a message, hey, can I come on the podcast? Yeah, no problem at all. Well, what do you want me to do? Who do you want, what do you want me to say? And I'm like, I don't want you to say anything. I want you to just come on, be yourself, tell your journey. It's not it's not my journey, it's yours. I want to hear about your journey, and we'll talk, and I'll ask some questions, but and people just too quick to judge, too quick to judge. But here you are, right? You've been,
Yeah,
you've
but it's
been
with
through
love
so much.
and passion.
What'd you say? Yeah.
Oh, so it does no good. So these are things again that I was able to experience as a child that I hated. I absolutely hate. So now as an adult and as a healer and a spiritual wound healer and all that the stuff, all that good stuff that you said about me in my intro, I have the capacity to do it with compassion now.
Yeah.
But there is a reverse side of that as well, because compassion without boundaries is also emotional suicide. So that's where I am in my journey now. And not only in my journey within myself, but in my journey within my teaching and my coaching.
Yeah.
So yes, you do have compassion, but you can have compassion with boundaries. Yes, you are always in a state of healing, but you should not be healing from the same thing over and 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 over again. That means there's some victimization somewhere.
Yeah.
So let's take a look of what's not getting you out of the loop, and let's get out of the loop. And so yes, where there always may be something you are healing from, there is a journey from healing to being healed.
Healed. Yeah. Yeah. And that's a big thing, going from healing to healed, because, some people will say, oh, I'm broken. I'm too broken. I can't be healed. I can't be, I can't heal. I think everybody can be healed, but you have to go through the healing first to be healed.
What I've run into with that is a lot of times, okay, you said we're uncensored.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I talk about this in my next book. I call it trauma porn.
Yeah.
When you're dealing with people like that, sometimes who are repetitively broken, repetitively injured, repetitively the victim, kind of leads over into sorts of narcissism.
Yeah.
We might get into that later. But I call it trauma porn because they're addicted to the feeling of being able to get off. And it's get off or get out of accountability, because in order to heal, you got to be accountable.
Exactly.
To get out of being responsible, because in order to heal, you have to be responsible. And so that's my term. It's kind of nasty, but trauma
Trauma
porn.
porn. Yeah, it makes
addicted to
sense.
trauma.
So what are you doing now currently? Let the people know.
So I am back doing spoken word again. I have authored 2 books that are published now. The first book is, I started a series called Read Me for Filth. And that actually started from a question in one of my therapy sessions. And she told me to, because she knows I'm a writer. So she said, yeah, go journal about this. And it turned into the Read Me for Filth series. And so that first book is Read Me for Filth, how to drag yourself out of your own bullshitting.
Yeah.
Right. And so that was an inward look at myself and why I was repeating some of the same patterns. Because at some point you have to stop pointing the finger at everybody else, because in your life, yes, what people did to you when you were unable to protect yourself, they have to answer for that. But for the things that you do as an adult, you're responsible. You're responsible for you. And so I had to come to that determination that is, yeah, as much as I can blame other people about what they've done to me, I allowed it. And so what was it about me that allowed certain things as an adult? And so that's where that first book was born. Now, the second book, I actually started writing that 19 years ago.
Okay.
I just finished the first book first, then I went back and I finished the second book. And so that one is I Know What You Want, But an Ass Is All You Need, Faith, Trauma, and the Unlikely Road to Redemption. right? So that book is pretty much about sometimes what we think we need to fulfill destiny is not what's called for,
Yeah.
right? I was reading a text, funny thing, because actually the way me and God talk to each other, we kind of petty
Yeah.
and we joke with each other a lot. And so I was reading a text when Jesus rode in on the donkey, and I love horses, right? And so I love Clydesdales. And so I was thinking to myself, I'm thinking in my head because I forgot, he could hear that. And so I was thinking in my head, I would have rode in on a Clydesdale. And I immediately heard that's your problem. From that came the second book. And so I have a third book that will be released February the 14th. I'm strategically releasing it on Valentine's Day,
Okay.
and that will be the second book in the Read Me for Filth series. And that one is Relationships in the Bloody Trail and Escaping the Predatory Powers of Spiritual Narcissism. So writing my books, doing spoken
That
word.
seems like a lot in that title, you know? Can you break that down a little bit?
Yes. So narcissism is one thing. Spiritual narcissism is a whole different
Beast.
monster because you have the level of narcissism, and then you have people who use God as a preface or a cover to do harm, to do narcissistic harm. And again, in church, we are taught that silence is obedience. And when you speak up about it, um, you're problematic. You're Jezebel, or you're a harlot, or you're a whore, or you're all these things because you speak up. Now some people who they are, you know, there's the duality of it, and you do have some Jezebels. But when you have seeing what goes on in the background. I'm a leader myself.
Yeah.
I've preached to myself. I'm a prophet myself. And so I have been exposed to things that laity may not see or normally does not see. And I decided that I can no longer go along just for silence sake for other people to be comfortable. And I decided that like back in my 30s, again, when I had the dream that I was telling you about. When you see something, you say something. And there's order and protocol to the way you say it. But when you see something, you say something. And one of the most unchecked places that unhealed people can go harm other people is the pulpit.
Yeah.
Because there's no check.
No.
They hide behind God.
Yeah. So true. So true. And that's, even like, in the Catholic Church, they hide behind the podium. And, there was so much that went on here in Boston specifically with sex
Yes.
abuse and, ruined a lot of kids'
It happens.
lives. And,
It's not just the Catholic Church, I promise.
yeah.
It's not just the Catholic Church.
Yeah. Yeah.
We have sexual abuse, spiritual abuse. It happens all over.
So,
But if no one says anything about it and no one addresses it, then it continues to go on. So this is what I decided to do. Because you have duality, right? There's always going to be good people. There's going to be bad people. There are going to be good churches. There are going to be bad churches. It's going to be day. It's going to be night. It's going to be up. It's going to be down. There's always going to be duality. So you can't change a person. What you can do is be able to define, identify, create boundaries around yourself.
yeah.
And then that way, you're not exposed to it. You're not harmed by it. And once you have the fortitude around yourself, then you begin teaching others. And then hopefully, as more people learn how to trust their own self and how to trust their own boundaries, then the light of the wolves will begin to dim.
Damn, yeah. Whew. Preach. Preach, sister. Now you ready for a couple questions? Okay, so in your healing journey, what wound did you resist confronting the longest and why?
That's a good one. I'm gonna try not to be poetic, but here we go. The madness of a thing called me. That was the wound.
Yeah.
You go through therapy, you go through rounds of therapy, and you go through rounds of conversations, and you go through rounds of altar calls, and you go through rounds of people laying their hands on you. And you still try to figure out, well, why is this not working? If I could be honest. And one day, I was looking in the mirror in the bathroom and I was just staring at myself. And I said, I forgive you. And I had a whole meltdown, breakdown on the floor, crying in the bathroom moment.
Yeah. But you forgave yourself.
Because even as a child, I felt because in the beginning I was trained and groomed that what he was doing That's what dads do to show their daughters love.
Yeah.
And then when we were allowed to go, it was like almost as soon as we were allowed to go out into somewhere public, somebody was talking about their dad. And so I started talking about my dad.
Yeah.
I didn't know I was telling. And so when I found out that I had been tricked, that's when I kind of went from this really good child to this raging little kid.
Yeah.
So even with dealing with all of that trauma, it's circular. It's circular, right? You unpeel layers of it at a time. That was the biggest thing for me that had to say, you weren't dumb. You weren't dumb. You were tricked and you were manipulated,
Yeah.
but you weren't dumb.
No, not dumb at all. And you were a kid, you know?
Yeah. But I had held on to that. There's things that you subconsciously hold on to. And until you work through it, you sometimes you don't even have any idea that's what you're holding on to. I was beating myself up about things that I didn't at that time have any control over, which led me into living a lifestyle where I could control that I still chose recklessly because I felt like it was my dang on decision.
Yeah.
So going back to the root of it.
So a couple more questions. So you've lived both ministry and artistry. Where do those two worlds collide and where do they break each other?
So ministry, and I call it now minstrel. I love it seeing it on platforms. Of course, you have your obvious, you have your worship singers, you have your musicians, your praise dancers, your flat. All of that is art. For me, it kind of blends because it starts handing off into performance ministry.
Yeah.
But there are artists who perform, or not necessarily perform, who are in the church now, that they are not performing there. They're actually giving what is due unto God. And you can tell the difference in the sound. You can tell the difference in the movement. You can tell the difference in the speech, the words. You can tell the difference when someone is giving unto God versus talking for a man or performing for a man or performing for a shout.
Yeah, they're living it almost.
You have to. I think the season of being unauthentic
Yeah.
is about over.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest things, and I think one of the things you were talking about healing too was you forgave yourself, I myself, have only been on my healing journey for a short period now. But that was one of the first things I had to do was stop beating myself up over
Mhm.
just some decisions that were made, maybe not even decisions that I made, decisions made from others as well. And forgive myself and forgive them. And, so I'm just a couple months out on my journey. But when I tell you, when I looked in the mirror and I forgave myself and I forgave them, it felt like,
Something breaks.
it felt like the world was lifted off my shoulders and I could breathe finally,
Yeah, something breaks.
just gave it up to God. So, two more questions. So, your books confront internal narratives with unapologetic honesty. What internal narrative are you currently rewriting? And I think we've already talked about that, about the new book.
Mhm. Yeah, that's the spiritual narcissism, and a lot of that narrative for me now. Again, there's nothing that I can say, do, or write with conviction unless I have gone through it or I am going through it myself.
Yourself,
And
exactly.
so my writing, I look at it as a, two-way sword. It cuts backwards and
Yeah.
forwards. So even now, like with my first book, right? I wrote it from the perspective of being the client of my therapist. And that's how I wrote it. But then I also wrote parts of it as being the healer of myself or going through the healing process myself. And then I sold it, to help other people heal the journal. And then I got my own dang copy and I autographed a copy to my freaking self. And then, as you can see, it's all beat up and torn up because I go back through
You
again.
just read.
Yeah, I write for me to be healed at first,
Yeah.
to cut me, heal me first. And then I write for the readers. And then I still circle back around and read for me.
So before we get to the last question, so where can people purchase the book?
So these first two books, I apologize. These first two books are available on Amazon.
Okay.
I do have an author bio on Amazon. So if you look up HAE space The Prophet, you'll find the first two books. The third book that's coming out in February will be on all platforms. And eventually these first two books will be on all platforms as well. Or just contact me directly.
Okay.
Every show that I do, I always have copies of my books for sale.
Perfect.
So
Yeah, and
I am
I'll make sure once we we'll be posting some clips, over the next 2
okay.
days, Thursday and Friday, before we drop this on Saturday morning. But I'll also be tagging the book, so for the listeners can you know go grab some as well. So the last question: so if readers remember only one message from your journey, your books, your voice, your becoming, what do you want that message to be?
Okay. So this may sound a little weird, but just hear me out, right? Fact check before you feel. And that's a whole nother show by itself.
We'll have to bring you
So
back for that.
yeah, so just a quick tidbit. You know, a lot of times we get into things and we're emotional, right?
Yeah.
We get into relationships emotional. We get into sexual encounters and it becomes emotional. We get into business ventures and it may be based off emotion, like get rich quick. So we get into all these things based on emotions, and then at the end of the day, you may find out something totally different because you didn't do your research in front of the issue, and then you find out information in your lap after the issue.
Yeah.
So healed people fact check before they feel. And not only is that an outward thing, that's an internal thing too. So before I get angry, before I get pissed off at you, Jim, the first thing I need to go do is fact check myself
Yeah.
before I feel an emotion about being pissed off at you. What is it about me? So that's my altar call. Heal people, fact check before you feel.
Perfect. Perfect. So, I appreciate you coming on. I appreciate you, sharing your journey with us. When we started this, today, this talk, I didn't think we were going to go from a young girl to the streets, to the ministry, to the stage of being being a model, to a writer, then back to the
Hmm.
church, and you've done it all. You've done it all. You've talked about some of that different jobs that you've done, different things on the streets that you've done, and there's no stone left unturned. You're an open book. And that's what I love about my podcast is I haven't had anyone on like you that's willing and able to share everything. You know, like when I talk to certain people, they'll tell me like, hey, because I'll send them some questions. They'll be like, oh, I don't feel comfortable talking about this or this. So I appreciate that. So and I'd just like to say, there are conversations that fill time, and then there are ones like this that fill space. This was the latter.
Mm,
Spending this time with Prophet Harmony reminds us that often purpose often hides inside pain, and that healing doesn't happen once. It happens every time we decide to be whole again.
hmm.
She's what I call a disruptor of denial. Someone who doesn't just tell the truth, but walks it out. And through every word today, whether prophetic or poetic, she modeled what it looks like to live unfiltered, unafraid, and unbound. Her story echoes something bigger than personal redemption. It's a blueprint for rebirth. She showed us that endings can be altars, that loss can be instruction, and that being broken doesn't mean you're beyond repair. It means you're ready for rebuilding. And if you listen closely, you heard the through line: truth doesn't hurt nearly as much as pretending does.
Mm,
I hope this episode stirred something in you. A reminder that your pain has purpose, your story still matters, and your restoration is not just possible, it's waiting for your permission. So to my sister in vision and voice, Prophet Harmony, thank you. Thank you for being an architect of restoration and a voice for liberation. And to everyone listening, may you leave this conversation braver than you came, freer than you were, and more determined to tell your own truth with humility and heat. And remember, but healing starts with you. Peace and love. Thank you so much, sis. I appreciate it. Peace and love. Uncle Jimmy out.